Let me tell you something that nobody ever said to you clearly enough. The intensity with which you feel things is not a character flaw. It is not immaturity. It is not something you need to toughen up out of, or learn to control or apologize for in the way you have probably been apologizing for it your entire life. It is a neurological reality, a documented, researched, measurable difference in how your brain processes experience, emotional experience specifically, that produces a fundamentally different relationship with the world than the people around you have. And the reason most people who feel everything deeply spend so much of their lives treating that depth as a problem is not because the depth is a problem. It is because nobody ever gave them the science. That changes today. Let's start with the biology, because this is where the conversation needs to begin and almost never does. Elaine Aron's research on what she called the highly sensitive person developed across decades of clinical and empirical work, and now representing one of the most robustly documented individual difference variables in personality psychology, identified a trait she called sensory processing sensitivity, a neurological characteristic present in approximately 15 to 20% of the population that is characterized by deeper cognitive processing of both sensory and emotional information. The highly sensitive nervous system does not just receive more information, it processes it more thoroughly, more layers extracted, more connections made, more meaning generated from the same experience that a less sensitive nervous system would process more quickly and move on from. This is not a metaphor. Neuroimaging research by Bianca Acevedo and colleagues at the University of California found that highly sensitive individuals showed significantly greater activation in brain regions associated with awareness, empathy, and integration of sensory information when viewing emotional stimuli. The difference is not psychological interpretation, it is neurological architecture. The person who feels everything deeply is not overreacting. Their brain is doing more with the same input, processing at a depth that most nervous systems do not reach with the same information. That is not fragility. That is a different calibration of the system that processes experience. And calibration is not the same as dysfunction. Now let's talk about empathy, because this is the finding that explains the experience most deeply feeling people describe as one of their most exhausting and most meaningful characteristics. The capacity to feel what other people feel, not just to understand it intellectually, to actually experience it, to walk into a room and feel the emotional weather before a word has been spoken, to absorb other people's distress in a way that is not a choice but a reflex. The neuroscience of this is centered on the mirror neuron system, the neural architecture that fires both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing it, when you feel an emotion and when you witness someone else feeling it. Research by Vittorio Galeazzi and colleagues on mirror neuron function and the subsequent work connecting mirror neuron activity to empathic response found that individuals with higher empathic sensitivity show greater mirror neuron activation in response to observed emotional states. The other person's emotional experience does not just register as information, it registers as something closer to shared experience. For the person who feels everything deeply, this mechanism is running at a higher intensity than average. Other people's pain is not something they observe. It is something their nervous system partially enacts. Their joy is not something they witness. It is something their body partially mirrors. This is why deeply feeling people find certain environments, hospitals, conflict, sustained exposure to others' distress, profoundly draining in ways that are not about weakness. The mirror system is doing physiological work, real neurological work, that costs real neurological resources. And it is why deeply feeling people are often the most genuinely present people in a room, not performing empathy, actually experiencing something closer to what the other person is experiencing than most people are capable of. Here is something the research identifies that most people who feel deeply have never heard framed this way. Research by Lisa Feldman Barrett on emotional granularity, the ability to identify and distinguish between specific emotional states with precision, is directly relevant to understanding the deeply feeling person's relationship with their own inner world. Barrett's research found that individuals differ significantly in the degree to which they can differentiate between emotional states. Low granularity individuals experience broad, undifferentiated emotional states. they feel bad, they feel good. The resolution of their emotional experience is relatively coarse. High granularity individuals experience emotional states with considerably more precision. They feel the specific quality of sadness that is about loss as distinct from the sadness that is about disappointment. They feel the specific texture of anxiety that is anticipatory as distinct from the anxiety that is reactive. Their emotional experience has a resolution that low granularity individuals simply do not access. And the research on the consequences of emotional granularity is significant. Barrett's work found that individuals with higher emotional granularity showed better emotional regulation, better interpersonal functioning, greater resilience in the face of difficult experience, and better physical health outcomes across a range of measures. The person who feels everything deeply is not just experiencing more emotion, they are experiencing it in higher resolution, with more precision, with more information available from the emotional experience than a less differentiated processor would receive. That information is a resource. When the person who feels deeply has the framework to use it as information rather than being overwhelmed by it as sensation, it becomes one of the most sophisticated sources of intelligence available to human cognition. Now here is the one that most deeply feeling people recognize immediately, and the one that the research explains with a precision that most deeply feeling people have never encountered. The process of differentiating between self-generated emotion and emotion absorbed from the environment, from other people, from social situations, from the emotional content of media and art, and the accumulated weight of the world, is a cognitive process, one that requires the brain to maintain a clear boundary between what originated inside and what arrived from outside. For the deeply feeling person, this boundary is more permeable than average, not as a failure of development. As a consequence of the higher empathic sensitivity and the more active mirror neuron system we discussed, research on what psychologists call emotional contagion, the automatic and unconscious transmission of emotional states between people, by Elaine Hatfield and colleagues found that susceptibility to emotional contagion varies significantly between individuals, and that high susceptibility, picking up other people's emotional states automatically and intensely, is associated with the same sensitivity profile that characterizes the deeply feeling person. The practical consequence is one of the most disorienting experiences in the deeply feeling person's daily life. They do not always know whether what they are feeling is theirs or whether they absorbed it from the person they just spent time with, from the news they just consumed, from the mood of the room they just walked through. This is not confusion. It is the predictable consequence of a system with high permeability running in a world full of other people's emotional states. And understanding it as a system characteristic rather than a personal failing changes everything about how it can be managed. Here is the finding that almost never makes it into the conversation about deep feeling, and it is one of the most important for understanding the full profile. The research on what psychologists call aesthetic sensitivity, the depth of response to beauty in art, music, nature, and human experience, consistently finds that it co-occurs with the broader sensitivity profile we have been discussing. Aaron's research on the highly sensitive person specifically identified aesthetic sensitivity as one of the core features of the profile, not just sensitivity to negative stimuli, to pain, to conflict, to others' distress. Equal sensitivity to positive stimuli, to beauty, to the specific quality of light at a certain time of day, to music that moves through the body rather than just the ears, to the moment in a story where something true is said in a way it has never quite been said before. Research by Matthew Sachs and colleagues at the University of Southern California on the neuroscience of aesthetic chills, the physical response to particularly moving music or art, found that individuals who experience these responses more frequently and more intensely show differences in brain connectivity between auditory regions and regions associated with social and emotional processing. Their brains are literally more connected between the experience of beauty and the experience of feeling. The person who feels everything deeply does not just suffer more deeply than average. They experience beauty more deeply than average. They are moved more completely, more physically, more lastingly. That is not a small thing. That is access to a dimension of human experience that most people encounter at the surface, and the deeply feeling person encounters all the way down. And Here is the finding that ties everything together, the one that most deeply feeling people have never heard, framed in a way that makes the connection clear. The same neurological characteristics that produce depth of emotional processing produce depth of cognitive processing. This is not coincidence. It is the same underlying system, the sensory processing sensitivity, the more active default mode network, the higher integrative complexity, expressing itself across both the emotional and intellectual domains simultaneously. Research by Aaron and colleagues found that sensory processing sensitivity was associated not just with emotional reactivity, but with cognitive depth, with the tendency to process information thoroughly, to make connections across domains, to notice details and implications that less sensitive processors miss. This means the person who feels everything deeply is also, very often, thinking about everything deeply. The emotional richness and the intellectual richness are not separate characteristics. They are expressions of the same underlying neurological profile, and the research on the outcomes of this combined profile is important. Studies on the relationship between emotional sensitivity and creative achievement found significant associations between the sensitivity profile and creative output across domains. The emotional depth feeds the creative depth. The richness of the inner emotional world is the material that the creative mind works with. The person who feels everything deeply is not suffering from an excess of emotion that their intelligence should be able to manage. They are running an integrated system in which the emotional and intellectual are more connected than most people's systems allow. And the richness of that integration, when it has a framework to operate within, is the source of some of the most important things human beings create and understand and contribute. Here is what I want you to take from this. The brain that feels everything deeply is not a brain in need of fixing. It is a brain with a specific neurological profile, documented, researched, measurable, that processes experience at a depth that most nervous systems do not reach. The empathy that absorbs other people's pain is the same system that generates genuine human connection at a depth most people never access. The aesthetic sensitivity that makes music physical and beauty overwhelming is the same sensitivity that makes art and meaning and genuine human creativity possible. The emotional granularity that makes the inner world so complex and so demanding is the same granularity that the research identifies as associated with better regulation, better resilience, better outcomes across almost every measure that matters. The cost of this profile is real. The exhaustion of absorbing what other people feel, the difficulty of the permeable boundary between self and world, the intensity of experience in a world that is not always calibrated for intensity, the years of being told, implicitly or explicitly, that the depth is too much, that you should feel less, react less, be affected less. That message was wrong, not because the cost is not real, because the cost and the capacity are the same thing. You cannot reduce the depth of the feeling without reducing the depth of everything that the feeling makes possible. The research is clear on this. The nervous system that feels everything deeply is not a nervous system that needs to be quieted. It is a nervous system that needs to be understood, and understanding it, really understanding it, with the actual science rather than the cultural verdict that has always told you the depth was a problem, is the beginning of using it as what it actually is. The most human thing about you.